The day my manager told me I wasn't getting my bonus, I didn't flip a table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even blink. I just sat there in that chair, the one with the wobbly armrest that facilities had been looking into for 6 months, and felt something very quiet happen inside me. Like a door clicking shut, not slamming, just closing. That sound would cost him everything. I'd been with the company for 9 years. 9 years of early mornings and late Fridays, and the kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't show up on any org chart. My title was Vendor Compliance Coordinator, which, I know, sounds like someone who alphabetizes purchase orders. Most people assumed that's exactly what I did. What I actually did was maintain the certification and licensing records for every third-party vendor we worked with, 41 vendors at last count, and make sure that every single one of them was in good standing with state and federal requirements before any contract could be signed, renewed, or funded. In our industry, regional infrastructure contracting, you cannot legally close a deal without a clean vendor compliance file. Full stop. No exceptions. Not for anything. I also managed the surety bond tracking system, cross-referenced our insurance certificates against contract minimums every quarter, and kept the master log of our designated approval signatories on file with 3 different regulatory bodies. If any of that sounds dry, it is. It's also the kind of thing that, when it works, nobody notices. When it doesn't, everything stops. For 9 years, everything worked. My previous manager, who retired 2 years before all of this happened, used to say I was the only person in the building who understood the full picture. He'd stop by my desk just to check in. He knew my vendors by name. He'd ask how the bond renewals were going the same way someone asks about your kids. When he left, they brought in someone from outside. His name was Nathan. 34 years old, MBA from a school he mentioned in his first team meeting, his second team meeting, and what I can only assume would have been every team meeting thereafter had things gone differently. He came from a logistics software company that did things very differently, and he had a lot of opinions about efficiency and automation and streamlining the paper-heavy stuff. I knew we were going to have a problem the first week. When he asked me to walk him through my workflow and spent most of it nodding at his phone, I knew it was a real problem 6 months later during my annual review. My reviews had always been strong. I'm not saying that to brag, I'm saying it because it's documented. Exceeds expectations, 2 years running. A commendation letter from our VP of Operations after I caught a surety bond discrepancy that would have voided a $4.2 million contract 48 hours before close. My previous manager had written, verbatim, in my last review, "This department does not function without her." Nathan had been my manager for 8 months when review season came around. He rated me meets expectations across the board. I sat across from him in the small conference room, the one with the whiteboard that always had someone else's brainstorm still on it, and I read through the evaluation form carefully. He'd written that my work was process-oriented and consistent, but lacked strategic initiative and cross-functional visibility. I asked him what that meant. He said I was good at maintaining existing systems, but hadn't shown leadership in evolving them. I asked him what he thought my role was. He said, and I remember this precisely because I wrote it down that same afternoon, "You keep the files clean. That's important, but it's not high impact." The bonus pool that year was 15% of base salary. I received 0. He said the budget was tight and the allocation had to go to people in revenue-adjacent roles. I said, okay. I picked up my copy of the evaluation form. I thanked him for his time. I walked back to my desk, and then I started making a plan. I want to be clear about something. I did not sabotage anyone. I did not delete files. I did not corrupt records or tip off regulators or do anything that could be described, even loosely, as malicious. Everything I did was completely and malicious. Everything I did was completely, entirely, boringly legal. I started updating my resume that night. Within 3 weeks, I had 2 interviews. Within 6, I had an offer, a compliance manager role at a firm across town. Better title, 22% salary increase, actual bonus structure in writing. I gave my 4 weeks notice on a Tuesday morning. Nathan received my resignation letter and looked briefly like someone who just realized they'd left the stove on. He asked if there was anything he could do to keep me. I said the decision was final. He nodded and said he understood and that he was sure we'd find coverage. I finished out my notice period doing exactly what I was supposed to do. My assigned tasks, fully, on time, professionally. What I did not do, because no one asked me to and because it was not in my job description, and because I had given notice and my replacement had not yet been identified, was document the internal logic of the systems I managed. The vendor compliance database I'd built out over 4 years lived in a shared drive that only I had ever fully mapped. The surety bond renewal calendar I maintained was in a spreadsheet linked to a master tracker that I had built, formatted, and cross-referenced by hand. The signatory log, the document that listed which employees were designated as authorized compliance officers on file with our state licensing board, was something I updated every time there was a personnel change. I updated it the week after my last day was scheduled. My name came off. No one asked me to flag it. No one asked me anything, actually. Nathan sent a goodbye Slack message to the team channel. Someone ordered a sheet cake. I left on a Friday. The following Monday, I started my new job. The call came 11 weeks later. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was right, so I picked up. It was one of my old colleagues. Someone I genuinely liked, someone who had nothing to do with any of what happened. Her voice was very careful in the way voices get when someone is trying not to say something that will get back to them. She told me there was a situation. She said she thought I should know, just in case anyone reached out to me. A deal had been frozen, not a small one. The company had been working on a contract renewal with a municipal infrastructure client, a deal that had been in progress for over a year, one I had been tracking before I left. The total contract value was $312 million over 5 years. It was, by a significant margin, the largest renewal they'd ever handled. The deal had been submitted for final sign-off. Standard process, the client's compliance team requests a current vendor certification packet. The packet goes out. Everyone signs. Money moves. Except the certification packet came back flagged. The signatory on file with the state licensing board, the designated compliance officer whose name and credentials had to appear on the certification, was me. And my credentials had expired because I was no longer employed by the company. Because I had left, and because no one had updated the signatory log after my departure, my name was still the only one on record. You cannot close a deal of that size, or any size, in this state with an expired designated compliance signatory. The client's legal team flagged it immediately. The deal went into hold status. The client sent a formal notice of non-compliance. According to my colleague, the emergency meeting that morning had involved Nathan, 2 VPs, the general counsel, and eventually the owner himself. The owner, who had started this company 40 years ago and still came in every morning at 7, had sat at the head of the table and said, very quietly, "How did this happen?" Nathan had said, "We had a staffing transition." The owner had said, "Who was the signatory?" Someone had looked it up. Someone had read my name out loud. The owner had said, "Get her on the phone. I should tell you something about the owner." His name was Theodore. Everyone called him Ted, and he was the kind of person who knew the name of every person in his company, including the part-time receptionist who came in on Thursdays. He had personally approved my commendation letter 3 years earlier. He had sent me a handwritten note while my mother was in the hospital. He was not the kind of person who let things like this happen without understanding exactly why they happened. I didn't hear from him directly that day. What I got was an email from the general counsel's assistant asking if I would be available for a call. I said I might be, depending on what the call was about. She called me back in 10 minutes and told me the company was in a compliance hold on a major contract and that my name was on the signatory file. I said I was aware my name had been on the signatory file. She asked if I would be willing to assist. I said I would have to think about it. She said they were hoping I could make a decision soon given the time sensitivity. I said I understood. I thanked her for calling. I hung up. Then I called my new manager, explained the situation briefly, professionally, without detail, and asked if I could take a long lunch the following day. He said sure, and told me to take care of what I needed to take care of. I want to pause here because I've told this story to a few people and they always ask the same thing. Were you angry? Yes, but not in the way people expect. I wasn't angry in the loud way. I wasn't sitting at home replaying the conversation with Nathan and thinking about what I should have said. I was angry the way you get angry at something structural, at a system that consistently undervalues the people who actually hold it together, that mistakes invisibility for unimportance, that hands authority to people who've never had to understand the work they're managing. Nathan wasn't some cartoon villain. He was just someone who genuinely did not know what I did, had never bothered to find out, and had made a high confidence bet that what he didn't know couldn't hurt him. That bet had just come due. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt the specific exhaustion of having been right about something you wish you'd been wrong about. But I also knew what I was worth now. And that made everything that came next a lot easier to navigate. The second call came 2 days later, and this time it was Ted himself. His voice was the same as I remembered. Measured, unhurried, the voice of someone who had been in enough difficult rooms to know that panicking doesn't help. He asked how I was doing at my new position. I told him it was going well. He said he was glad to hear it. Then he said, "I suspect you know why I'm calling." I said I did. He said he'd spent the past 2 days reviewing the situation carefully. He said he'd spoken with Nathan and with the VPs and with the general counsel. He said he had some questions, but before he got to them, he wanted to say something. "I didn't know," he said, "the full scope of what your role involved. I should have. That's on me." I didn't say anything. He said, "Nathan told me you maintained the signatory records." He didn't tell me, or perhaps didn't know, that you were the only person whose name was on file with the state board. No backup designated officer. No secondary contact. Just you. I said, "That's correct." He said, "In 9 years, had anyone ever discussed adding a secondary signatory?" I said, "I had flagged it twice in writing, once 3 years ago, once 18 months ago. Both times it was tabled as a low priority item." There was a pause. He said, "Do you still have documentation of those requests?" I said I did. Another pause. Longer. He said, "What would it take for you to help us resolve this situation?" I had thought about this. I want to be honest about that. I had thought about it carefully, and I had talked it through with my husband, and I had written out a number on a piece of paper and looked at it for a while to make sure I still believed it when I wasn't in the moment. I told Ted that I was happy in my new role and had no interest in returning full-time. He said he understood. I said that I could, however, make myself available as an outside consultant to assist with the signatory transition and the certification process. I quoted my rate. It was not a modest rate. It was the rate of someone who understood exactly what they were being asked to do and exactly what it was worth. He said, "That's fair." He said it immediately without negotiating, which told me everything I needed to know about how bad the situation was and how much they understood now what they hadn't understood before. We spent the next 40 minutes on the logistics. I would prepare the documentation to update the signatory records with the state board, consult on transitioning the vendor certification files to whoever would be managing them going forward, and be available for any follow-up questions during the client's compliance review. I would bill at my quoted rate for every hour, everything in writing. Before we hung up, Ted said one more thing. He said, "I want you to know I'm handling the internal situation as well." I said I appreciated that. He said, "Nathan evaluated your role as low impact." I said, "He did." He said, "I'll be evaluating that evaluation." I worked the consulting engagement over the span of about 3 weeks. It was strange being back in those systems, familiar and foreign at the same time, the way it feels to visit a city you used to live in. Some things were exactly as I'd left them. Some things had already started to drift. The deal went through. The client accepted the corrected certification packet. The contract was executed. $312 million, 5-year term, signed and funded. My colleague texted me when it closed. "Finally, thank you. Also, you didn't hear this from me, but N is out." I texted back a thumbs up. Nathan's departure was not announced with fanfare. There was no company-wide email. Someone updated the org chart on the shared drive, and that was more or less it. I heard through the same colleague that the conversation with Ted had been, in her words, very short. I never reached out to Nathan. There was nothing to say. He'd made the bet. It hadn't paid off. That's really all there is to it. What I think about sometimes now is the meeting where he told me I wasn't getting my bonus. Not because I'm still bitter about it, I'm genuinely not. I got a 22% raise, an actual bonus, and a manager who asks real questions about my work. The universe corrected fairly efficiently. What I think about is the word he used, consistent, like it was a mild compliment. Like 9 years of keeping 41 vendor relationships in clean compliance, tracking millions of dollars in bonded obligations, maintaining the company's legal standing with state regulators, like all of that was just showing up and doing the same small thing over and over. And the best you could say about it was that I'd done it reliably. Consistency in compliance is the whole job. You don't get points for dramatic interventions because the dramatic interventions don't happen if you do the work correctly. The absence of a crisis is the deliverable. And if you have to ask what that's worth, you probably shouldn't be managing the person responsible for it. I've thought about whether I should have documented the handover more thoroughly before I left, whether I had a professional or ethical obligation to flag the signatory gap more loudly on my way out. Honestly, no. I flagged it twice in writing during my tenure. I completed my 4 weeks. I did my job until my last day. The responsibility for understanding and maintaining critical operational knowledge belongs to the organization, not the individual who's been given notice. If they'd asked, I would have told them. They didn't ask. They assumed it would be fine. It almost wasn't. My new manager asked me once, a few months into the job, what I thought the most undervalued skill in compliance work was. I said, knowing what you're holding up. Most people in our field can find the errors, they can build the checklist, run the audit, identify the gap. What they can't always do is hold the full picture in their head. The upstream and downstream, the dependencies, the places where one expired signature or one missed renewal date can freeze a multi-million-dollar transaction at the worst possible moment. That's the thing Nathan never understood. He saw paperwork, he saw filing. He saw the administrative function that keeps the lights on and assumed that meant it was a lights on in the background kind of thing. Necessary. Fine, nothing special. He didn't see the structure I was holding up until I put it down. I don't tell the story to settle scores. Nathan is out there somewhere, presumably managing something or someone, and hopefully paying more attention this time. I don't know, and I don't particularly need to. My life is genuinely better than it was a year ago. Different building, better title, team that knows what I do and why it matters. I tell this story because I spent 9 years being told, in 100 small ways, that invisible work was unimportant work, that if no one could see the disaster you prevented, you hadn't really done anything. That the measure of impact was noise, visibility, drama, not the quiet daily act of keeping something critical from falling apart. And I want the people who do that work, the ones holding up systems that no one fully maps until they're gone, to hear it clearly. They will not know what you do, not until they have to. Make sure you know what it's worth before they figure it out. Because the moment they do, the terms change entirely. I've thought a lot about what actually happened here. Not the contract, not the money, not even Nathan's departure, though all of that matters in its own way. What I keep coming back to is something simpler and more uncomfortable. The relationship between how visible work is and how much it's believed to matter. Nathan wasn't a cruel person. I want to say that honestly. He wasn't sitting in his office scheming to undercut me. He just genuinely, completely, did not understand what I did. And he made the very human mistake of assuming that if he couldn't see it clearly, it probably wasn't that important. He rated me consistent, like it was a gentle consolation. He pointed the bonus toward people in revenue-adjacent roles, like compliance was something that happened around the real work instead of underneath it. That's the thing about structural work. The whole point is that when you do it right, nothing dramatic happens. There's no fire to put out. There's no last-minute save that everyone watches. There's just a company that keeps operating the way it's supposed to, day after day, because someone spent 9 years making sure it could. You can't put that in a performance review box very easily. You can't graph it. And so, people like Nathan look at it and see filing, and they write meets expectations, and they redirect the bonus, and they genuinely believe they've made a fair call. The cause and the effect here were not complicated, though. Nathan made a decision about what my work was worth. That decision changed my circumstances, which changed my choices, which changed the company's situation in ways that no one had mapped until they suddenly, urgently needed to. That's not revenge. That's just what happens when you remove something load-bearing and don't replace it. What I had to figure out, in those weeks between handing in my notice and getting Ted's phone call, was what I was going to do with what I knew. Not about the company, about myself. About what 9 years of that work had actually taught me and whether I trusted that knowledge enough to price it honestly. That's the part I think about most. The moment I wrote down that consulting rate and looked at it and didn't apologize for it, that took something. Not arrogance. I'm not talking about arrogance. I'm talking about the kind of quiet, grounded certainty that comes from actually knowing your own work, knowing not just what you do, but why it holds things up, knowing the difference between being replaceable and being interchangeable, and understanding which one you are. Intelligence without that self-knowledge is just skill floating loose. You can be good at something for years and still let other people define its value for you, still negotiate against yourself before the other side says a word. I did some version of that for a long time. I filed the warnings in writing, twice, and accepted it when they were tabled. I let low priority be the final word on something I knew mattered. That's not humility. That's giving someone else authority over your own assessment of your work. And eventually, that cost me a bonus and cost them a great deal more. Ted said that's fair, immediately. No pause, no counter. That moment told me something I needed to know. Not about him, but about what I'd been undercharging, in every sense for years. Integrity means doing the work correctly, whether or not anyone is watching. That part I had. What I learned, later than I should have, is that integrity also means knowing what the work is worth and not letting someone else's ignorance set the price. You can be exceptional and invisible for a very long time, but you don't have to accept the terms that come with it.